With that, let's give a warm welcome to our speaker, Bradley Smith.
Thank you, everyone. It's very good to be here. Do you think I'm close enough to the microphone? All right. So I'm going to start my talk focused on a very important topic. Funnel cake. And in particular, 1998. 1998 was a very good year for funnel cake. You might be wondering, why am I saying that? Well, in 1998, there was a newspaper article in the Los Angeles Times newspaper. And you can see the headline there. It says, "Funnel cake makes the fair go round." And this article declared that funnel cake was the king of the Orange County Fair. That's amazing. The thing is, funnel cake is a true Pennsylvania Dutch treat. So how did this Pennsylvania Dutch treat get to Los Angeles, California? It's a crazy story, actually. It begins with the Kutztown Folk Festival. So the Kutztown Folk Festival begins in the early 1950s, and there are a number of organizations who get involved with this event. One of them is the Virginville Grange. Has anyone ever been to Virginville, Pennsylvania? Oh, quite a few. It's a beautiful little town with lots of great old houses, lots of great history, very Pennsylvania Dutch. So in Virginville, they have a local Grange chapter. And the Virginville Grange wanted to develop a treat that they could make and sell at the Kutztown Folk Festival as a fundraiser. So one of the Grange members was this woman, Emma Miller. She had a funnel cake recipe, and she suggested her recipe. They liked the idea, and the Virginville Grange started making funnel cake at the Kutztown Folk Festival. About a year or two later, guess who shows up at the Kutztown Folk Festival? National Geographic magazine. They are studying this festival as sort of a unique cultural tradition, a cultural event of sorts. So October 1952, National Geographic, there's the date, Pennsylvania Dutch Folk Festival with map and 17 illustrations, and a detailed discussion of funnel cake. Suddenly, the world is reading about funnel cake from Virginville, Pennsylvania. 2 years after that, 1954, the Chicago Tribune has an article talking about funnel cake. And this interest spreads and spreads and spreads until 1998, when funnel cake is the king of the Orange County Fair, as declared by the Los Angeles Times. So from Virginville to Los Angeles. The thing is, this is just one way in which Pennsylvania Dutch culture has managed to trickle into mainstream American society. There are a lot of ways that I think people don't fully appreciate. They're just so normal, especially to us growing up in this area. They're just so normal, they don't really think about our unique impact. I'll just give you some examples. The Pennsylvania Dutch are responsible for pretzels. The first pretzel bakery, commercial pretzel bakery in the United States was in Lancaster County, Lidditz, yes. The first instance in American history where someone wrote about Groundhog Day, Southern Berks County. And incidentally, the person who wrote about this was not Pennsylvania Dutch, they were Welsh. And they were talking about the crazy Pennsylvania Dutch neighbors running around with a groundhog on February 2nd. And they were very confused by this. But Groundhog Day, nationally known holiday, the Pennsylvania Dutch are talking about it and celebrating it 2 centuries ago. The earliest illustration of an Easter bunny, Easter eggs, and an Easter basket in North America comes from Schuylkill County, about 1799. This is one of two illustrations from the same artist. The earliest depiction of these things in North America, really in the Western Hemisphere, because of the Pennsylvania Dutch. The earliest illustration of a Christmas tree in the Western Hemisphere, a Pennsylvania Dutchman in York County, and there you can see it right there. The date on this drawing is 1809, although we think that the artist was drawing it later than that, but he was recalling a scene from 1809. Also, the first instance of anyone talking about going out and cutting down a Christmas tree comes from a diary from some Pennsylvania Dutch people in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So all these firsts come from the Pennsylvania Dutch. I was recently having a discussion with my brother, and I was telling him, you know, the Pennsylvania Dutch really are important. They really are influential. And my brother kind of said, I don't know about that. I think mostly we're just a little silly and we talk a bit funny. And I said, no, I'll prove it to you. So we pulled up the Penn State, this is Penn State University's library catalog, and I typed in the word Pennsylvania Dutch. You'd be amazed how many hits I got. For books and media, 1,279 hits when I typed the words Pennsylvania Dutch. For journal articles, 33,400. So I said to my brother, you see, the Pennsylvania Dutch do matter. They've made a huge impact. There's something funny, though, and the reason I call this talk the curious legacy of the Pennsylvania Dutch. And I say that because we do have a great impact. And when you look at some of the book titles in the Penn State catalog, you see books on language, cooking, religion, art, hex signs or barn stars, holiday traditions, architecture, furniture, singing and dancing, folklore, and so much more. And yet, I'm amazed how many people don't even know what I'm talking about when I say I'm Pennsylvania Dutch. If I leave this area, I get a lot of confused expressions when I say this. And I'm going to share with you a story, well, not a story, a conversation that I seem to have over and over and over again. And the conversation goes like this, where I will say, I am Pennsylvania Dutch. And I exaggerate not when I tell you that at least 50 times I've heard the following response. But you don't look Amish. If I had $1 for every time I heard that, I could buy lunch for everyone in this room. And I'm not even exaggerating. I hear this over and over again. So for the record, Pennsylvania Dutch does not always equal Amish. It doesn't always equal Mennonite. Mennonites are Pennsylvania Dutch. Amish are Pennsylvania Dutch. But the Pennsylvania Dutch is much more than just that. The reason I think we have this misconception is, well, the blame lies with Lancaster County. After World War II, we get in the late 1940s, 1950s, the tourism industry in Lancaster County is really starting to grow. And they are promoting the Amish countryside, the Amish culture, as a tourism draw. And when you see the literature coming out, the tourism literature, what they do is they kind of mix up themes that are vaguely Pennsylvania Dutch. So for example, this is a program from the 1950s. We see a distal fink, a tulip, a heart that are very symbolic of sort of fancy Pennsylvania Dutch art from Berks County. Not to mention the decorated barns like you might see around Kutztown or Topton or Virginville. But right next to them, we have an Amish family. The Amish have no connection to that kind of, or very little connection to that kind of artistic symbolism. They're just throwing in the designers, the marketing team that designed that tourism pamphlet, they're just throwing things into this brochure that look nice. They aren't really concerned about cultural accuracy. So we have decades of this kind of tourism making people confused, making people assume that Pennsylvania Dutch equals Amish. Here's another one, greetings from the heart of Pennsylvania Dutch country, showing some Amish women. So if we were to go back in time to the 1700s, when Pennsylvania Dutch folks are coming here, the first Pennsylvania Dutch are coming here in large numbers, what we would find is that their numbers would include Mennonites and Amish, but also many, many more people. And if you had to, it's a little bit of an oversimplification to put everyone into categories by their denominational affiliation, but if you did do that, it would kind of look like this, with about 45% Lutheran, 45% Reformed, who later became UCC, and then kind of a catch-all category of about 10%, where we have Amish, Moravian, Mennonite, Schwenkfelder, Church of the Brethren, and groups like that. Everyone in this pie chart is Pennsylvania Dutch, including the Amish and the Mennonite, but they're just two small pieces of the pie. To put it another way, you could kind of split the Pennsylvania Dutch into two categories. And to use terms my parents would use, 90% are the fancy Dutch, and 10% are the plain Dutch. So, or as my dad said, so my mom's family, a lot of them were from a plain background. My dad was not. And I asked my dad one time, hey Pop, what's the difference between the fancy Dutch and the plain Dutch? And my dad said, in a Dutchy accent, well, we like beer and fun, and Mom's family hates both those things. So where did the Pennsylvania Dutch come from and when? How did they get here? Well, they came from primarily two areas in Europe, what is today southwest Germany, which, right there, a region sometimes known as the Palatinate region of Germany, and also German-speaking areas of Switzerland here. And the original Pennsylvania Dutch were 80,000 people who left this area from about 1683 to 1775. Incidentally, the reason they stopped coming in 1775, the American Revolution broke out, and suddenly all the port harbors like Philadelphia are closed off to shipping and to immigration. So why did they come? Many times you'll hear the thought, well, it's for religious freedom. And for some people, that was a very important reason they came. But the reasons were actually pretty complex. So for example, in Europe, in the 1600s, we had lots and lots of warfare. Wars that we only briefly touch on in a lot of our history classes here in America, but that really upset life in Central Europe in the 1600s and early 1700s. Some of these wars you've maybe heard of. The 30 Years' War was one. The War of Spanish Succession, the 9 Years' War. All these are wars that are disrupting the lives of people in especially southwest Germany. And even if the people in these areas are not directly impacted by the fighting, even if their lives are not in imminent danger, what ends up happening is they often are kind of living this life of being refugees, having to move around to avoid conflict. And when you're always moving around, it makes it hard to grow food, to sustain yourself. It makes it hard to earn a living. So even the people that were not in immediate risk of harm just had a very difficult life, a difficult time making a go of things. There was indeed religious persecution, especially for Anabaptist groups, groups like the Mennonites. Many, many were killed in the 1600s and the 1500s for their beliefs. We also had a strange weather situation in the 1600s in Central Europe. Historians that focus on geography sometimes call this the Little Ice Age. And particularly in the late 1600s, like the 1690s, we just had a period of very, very cold temperatures. Cold temperature means shorter growing season, more difficulties feeding the population, and making a living if you're a farmer. So all these factors kind of come together and make life in Central Europe difficult. So in the 1680s, William Penn emerges. He establishes the colony of Pennsylvania, and he wants people to come here. He wants Pennsylvania to be a place with religious liberty. He wants Pennsylvania to be a place that's economically successful. He wants Pennsylvania to be a place that does not have war. So he goes in search of people that he thinks would like to live in a place like that. And he goes to these people in Central Europe and says, come to Pennsylvania. The land is cheap. We have no militia in Pennsylvania, so you won't have to serve in the military or worry about these pesky wars. And we have religious freedom. So you can be Mennonite, Amish, Lutheran, Schwenkfelder, whatever you want, without being harassed. So that is very attractive to these 88,000 people that come from Europe to Pennsylvania. So they travel down the Rhine River like that, travel by boat down the Rhine River. They board ships in Rotterdam, which is a port city in the Netherlands. And then they come either with a stopover in England or directly to America. A lot of them come through Philadelphia and then settle out here in the countryside. So this is a map that I've created with a few friends of mine that kind of shows the pink are the most heavy areas of Pennsylvania Dutch settlement, and the green are areas that, while slightly less heavy, certainly have significant numbers of Pennsylvania Dutch as well. And you can see we are on this map right about here. So an interesting side note is that the English-speaking world was not entirely happy with this influx of foreigners who didn't speak English. For example, one person, who I won't identify yet, said the following: "Now they come in droves, and few of their children learn English. Unless the stream of their importation could be turned to other colonies, they will soon so outnumber us that we will not be able to preserve our language, and even our government will become precarious." So this person was not exactly pleased at all these Pennsylvania Dutch settlers. Does anyone know who that was? You're right, Ben Franklin said this. Now, Ben Franklin did say nice things about the Pennsylvania Dutch as well. He said, "I'm nervous about them. I don't like that they don't want to learn English." But he said, "These people work. They are hard workers." And he acknowledged that in his writings, that he appreciated their work ethic. Here's a magazine. This is the Literary Magazine and American Register. It's a magazine from 1803. They also weren't too happy about all these Pennsylvania Dutch folks. Here's what they said: "Everywhere we find the descendants of Germans. They are the principal settlers of this country and are a rude, uncultivated people, not noted for civility." Now I'm going to digress a bit and say that I think the reason for this comment ties in with just the culture of the Pennsylvania Dutch people. I remember many times at my dinner table as a little kid, when I was little, most of the people at the dinner table were speaking Pennsylvania Dutch. And they wouldn't say, "Would you please reach over and grab me the potatoes?" They would say, "Gate Marcel, give me that." Or "Long Marcel, pass me that." Or I remember being like a little kid and in the grocery store, and we were in the way of someone. They wouldn't say, "Excuse me, could I please get past you?" They would say something like, "Ik wil voorbijgaan. I want to pass by you." I remember one time I asked my dad, I said, "Dad, if someone is close to you and I accidentally bump into them, how do I say excuse me in Pennsylvania Dutch?" And my dad thought for a minute, and he said, "Oops." So, just the way our language is built, our what we call idiomatic expressions, the way we pattern words, just doesn't have a lot of politeness to it. But if you think about it, we were trying to stay out of the way of warfare for 100 years. Maybe when you're growing up generation after generation in that type of lifestyle, you're not so worried about politeness. You're more practical. And so I really think this is a situation where the outside world mistook Pennsylvania Dutch bluntness as rudeness, when it was just a part of our culture. So Lee mentioned the confusion about Pennsylvania Dutch or Pennsylvania German. And this is something I like to talk about because it is another source of misunderstanding. I've had people tell me, "Well, if you're Pennsylvania Dutch, then who are the Pennsylvania Germans?" It gets very confusing. The short answer, as Lee mentioned, they are the same thing. But I want to explain how we got to this confusing place. What is the difference? So I read so many different things. Well, this person says such and such, and that person says such and such. When it comes to understanding some of these topics, I really try to look to what the best experts say. I am only as good as on this subject as the sources I consult. And one that I really like is this man, Don Yoder. Don Yoder, he only passed away about 10 years ago at about the age of 100. He had been a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and a co-founder of the Kutztown Folk Festival. Very, very knowledgeable. So my understanding of this topic, I take from Don Yoder's writings. And here's how Don Yoder explains this confusion of Pennsylvania Dutch versus Pennsylvania German. And what he explains is that if you went back to Europe in the 1600s, the English language was just a little bit different. Words had sort of different meanings than what they carry today. So if you live in the red, you are, of course, English. If you're in the Iberian Peninsula, you're Spanish. If you're in the green there, you're French. And basically anyone else, they just called Dutch. Here's how he explains it, Don Yoder. The term Dutch goes back way before Shakespeare's time into the Middle Ages, and it meant to an Englishman anyone from the continent of Europe, especially from the Rhine Valley. So it's only kind of around the American Civil War that this is changing, and we call those people Germans, and Dutch is used for that much, much smaller area in what is today the Netherlands. Right there. Other sources kind of confirm this background. The Oxford Dictionary has under one of its definitions of Dutch, relating to the West Germanic speaking peoples inhabiting the area of northern and central Europe, now largely comprising Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and the Low Countries. Then it says, now historical or archaic. In other words, the language, the English language evolved. Dutch meant something broader than what it means today. So then where does Pennsylvania German come from? Well, in the later 1800s, we have Germany becoming a nation for the first time, and German is a term becoming more and more familiar to Americans. And there are a group of scholars in the United States who are concerned that as the language is evolving, people won't understand that the Pennsylvania Dutch are from a German background. So these folks, these scholars concerned about misunderstanding, developed this new term, Pennsylvania Germans. And growing up, I never ever heard anyone in my family refer themselves as Pennsylvania German. They always used Pennsylvania Dutch, the more traditional term. But they introduced this Pennsylvania German term, and now suddenly we have both. And I think in their effort to reduce confusion, they actually created more confusion. So we have the traditional term, Pennsylvania Dutch, which is archaic English, and the late 1800s term created by scholars. But they're all the same thing. Then we have other things like this that just even add more confusion. Lancaster tourism that implies incorrectly that we're from the Netherlands. So I wanted to also talk about the Pennsylvania Dutch language. This is also a source of much misunderstanding. And I'm going to go back to another Brad conversation that happens over and over and over again. The second conversation I have all the time goes like this. I will say, I speak Pennsylvania Dutch. And over and over and over again, I hear the following response. That's just German gibberish with some English. And whenever I hear this, I get all defensive and upset. And I say, no, it's not. But again, this is because of the Lancaster tourism industry, and specifically, books like this, for Good Old English, which is so popular they had a second edition. Well, someone else said, well, I want to get in on this, so we have How to Speak Dutchified English. So popular, that has a second volume. Now, this is funny, and I can laugh about this a little bit, but for some Pennsylvania Dutch folks, the way they talk has actually been a source of some hurt feelings a little bit. My mom would always tell the story that when she was in 4th grade, she had a teacher that was not Pennsylvania Dutch, that was from outside the area, and she said her 4th grade teacher would always harass her about the way she talked. And my mom would say, Vladimir, talk funny, I just talk the way I talk. And the teacher said, you gotta talk English right. And my mom, for years, would be upset about 4th grade and being harassed by her teacher. So this is, for some Pennsylvania Dutch folks, a little bit of a delicate topic. But the important thing I want to convey is because of this type of literature, there's a lot of misunderstanding, this incorrect assumption that the language is a gibberish language. It's not an actual language or an actual dialect. So I want to explain, I think it's important to dive a little bit into this to explain what actually is the Pennsylvania Dutch language. To do this, we have to go back in time about 500 years to the year 1500. In 1500, the situation in Central Europe was very, very different. There was no Germany. Germany did not exist as a nation until 1871. This is what the map of Europe, Central Europe, looked like at the time. That is the area east of France and west of Poland. I look at this and think, that is a cartographer's worst nightmare. That is a jumbled mess. And it was. It was this loose collection of fiefdoms and kingdoms and principalities, each with sort of a ruling duke or duchess or lord. It was a very, very confusing geopolitical situation. There was no such thing as a standard German language in this collection of kingdoms. There was no sense of a German national identity. So instead, people spoke regional dialects and they associated with their region. So you didn't say, I'm German. You might say, I'm Northern Bavarian and I speak Northern Bavarian dialect. You might say, I'm Hessian and I speak Hessian dialect. I'm Alsatian and I speak Alsatian dialect. So if you, let's just say right here, you're in Swabia and you speak the Swabian dialect, also known as Swabish, and you want to visit some cousins in West Central Bavaria, you're only geographically one region adjacent, so the dialects would be very close. You could understand each other pretty easily. It'd be like us visiting Pittsburgh, and they might say pop instead of soda, but we'll understand them. But then let's say you move from Swabia to Schleswig, where they speak Schleswigish dialect. That would be more of a stretch. This would be like us moving to Australia. They're still speaking an English language, but it's very different, harder to understand. So the Germans, the people of what's today Germany, they speak all these dialects. Most of them in 1500 are illiterate. They don't read and write. But the people that do read and write for church business, for government business, things like that, in 1500, they are actually still using Latin. Oops. And it's very much the same situation in the German-speaking areas of Switzerland at the time. So this all changes in the 1520s with the emergence of this guy, Martin Luther. So Martin Luther is interested in developing a Bible in a language that German people can understand. He doesn't like the fact that the only Bibles available to Germans are in Latin, and Germans need to rely on a priest to read and interpret, translate the Bible for them. He wants people to be able to read the Bible in their own language so it can speak to them directly. The only problem is we don't have a German language. We have Swabian and Hessian and Alsatian and Northern Bavarian. So what Martin Luther does is he starts writing this new Bible basically using the dialect of his home region, which is Upper Saxon dialect. So he uses that as kind of his starting point, but he also does a lot of study of words found within Germanic dialects. And he does a lot of tweaking. And I've read that Martin Luther might spend a month just trying to get one word right. And he spends years working on this Bible, starting with the New Testament and then the Old Testament. He finishes in the 1530s, and within just a few decades, 500,000 copies have sold to German-speaking people. And an amazing thing happens. What Germans start doing, for many of these Germans, this is the only book they've ever owned. So they buy this Martin Luther Bible, and as a family, even though they're basically illiterate, and this isn't even exactly in their dialect languages, they start to read the Bible together as a family. And they stumble through it at first, but slowly it starts to make sense to them. Slowly they can read it. They slowly start to become literate and understand this Martin Luther German. So what ends up happening, Martin Luther, in his attempt to create a theological revolution, ends up establishing both a language revolution, giving a new type of German to all these regional dialect speakers, and giving them literacy. So if we fast forward to about 1730, there have been some changes, and some things are still the same. There is still no such thing as a German nation. People are still speaking their regional dialects for daily conversation, at the dinner table, at the marketplace, at their place of employment. But there's a big change now. Many German-speaking people can now read and write in Martin Luther's German. So you can almost make the argument that the people in Central Europe, North Central Europe in the 1730s are bilingual in a sense, speaking their regional dialects and reading and writing in Martin Luther German. Whoops. And it's during this era that we start to see thousands and thousands of these people coming to Pennsylvania. And an interesting thing happens. They're coming from these areas. Whoops. So if you look at the dialect regions of the areas from which the ancestors of the Pennsylvania Dutch came, they encompass several different dialect regions. And they bring these dialects to Pennsylvania. So initially, if you'd be in Pennsylvania in 1730, if you'd be in this area in 1730, you might run into a Swabian speaker and an Alsatian speaker, a Hessian speaker. And those people can all kind of understand each other. But within a generation or two, those different dialects blend together and become Pennsylvania Dutch. The old dialects of Germany blend into the new Pennsylvania Dutch dialect. And I want to demonstrate one word that shows how this blending happened, using the word potato. Yeah. So, and I'm going to look at the word potato in 4 different dialect regions of Southwest Germany. So in the dialect of Westpfälzisch, they call this a Grumbier. But in Eastpfälzisch, on the other side of the Rhine River, they call it slightly different, Grumbia. Then you go down a little bit to where they speak South Franconian, and they say Grombier. And then further still to where they speak Swabish, they give that G a K sound, and they say Krombier. Each one of those is close enough that you would understand any person is talking about a potato, but they're all a little different. So in 1730, you might hear all 4 of those being said right here in northern Montgomery County. But by 50 years later, the first one, Grumbier, has emerged as the favorite of the Pennsylvania Dutch people. And that is essentially where Pennsylvania Dutch came from. It's a dialect created by the blending of other dialects. It is not gibberish. So now I'm going to jump ahead to 1800. The Pennsylvania Dutch are now well established here. 40% of Pennsylvanians speak Pennsylvania Dutch. Can you imagine? Almost half the state speaks Pennsylvania Dutch. This must have been a great glory period for the Pennsylvania Dutch people. Oops. So they're speaking Pennsylvania Dutch, their new dialect created from the blending of the old dialects. And they are still reading and writing Martin Luther German. So I have in my family a family Bible, and it says, the Bible, the entire Holy Scriptures, Old and New Testaments, and then it says, from Martin Luther, Dr. Martin Luther's translation. So this is the Martin Luther translation. and it's got an 1847 date here. And this belonged to my great-great-great-grandmother, whose family went to Faulkner Swamp Reformed Church just a few miles from here. So, and this is interesting because Bibli is Pennsylvania Dutch for little Bible. So in the 1840s, my three-greats-grandmother was still reading the standard German Bible, the Martin Luther Bible. She clearly knows Pennsylvania Dutch, but she's also dabbling in some English too. So this was very typical, though, in the early 1800s. They are still reading and writing in standard German. And they're learning their German in schools, most of them run by local churches. So, for example, this is a German language school in Reading, Pennsylvania, run by Trinity Lutheran Church. And if you go there, you're Pennsylvania Dutch, and you're learning about arithmetic and things like that, but you are learning to read and write in standard German. This was a school, the Trinity Lutheran German School in Reading, started in 1765. So this is very common. I think it's a misconception that the Pennsylvania Dutch didn't read and write very much. That's not true. They were pretty literate because of these church-run schools. And this continues into the 1830s. In the 1830s, you have tens of thousands of Pennsylvania Dutch people. They speak Pennsylvania Dutch. They read and write in standard German. They might know a little English, especially if they've got business connections to the outside world, but a lot of them don't know any English at all. But this changes in 1834 with something called the Pennsylvania School Act. So the Pennsylvania School Act establishes that Pennsylvania will offer free public schools. You don't have to pay for private school education anymore. Free public school will be available to everyone, but there's a catch. It's going to be in English, exclusively taught in English. This creates a paradox for the Pennsylvania Dutch, and I'll explain why, and I feel like I can get away with saying what I'm about to say. Pennsylvania Dutch are cheap. They like the idea of not having to pay to send their kids to school anymore. But here's where the paradox comes in. The Pennsylvania Dutch also hate change. So they don't want to give up their German language schools and embrace English. So it's a paradox, a quandary. We can save money, but it means we have to change. And they don't like this. So what ends up happening is they do eventually embrace public schools, but it doesn't happen fast. It's a slow process. It takes about 30 years, really, until they fully have switched over from German language private schools to English language public schools. So they really Pennsylvania Dutch parents had to decide what is the better option for us. Eventually, they go with the English language. And that Trinity Lutheran School I mentioned, they finally closed their doors in 1861. So now I'm going to fast forward to 1950. Things are really changing. It's been basically 100 years since Pennsylvania I should back up. It's been 100 years since the average fancy Pennsylvania Dutch person has been learning German language in private taught schools. So at this point, the only people who are learning German in their private schooling are Old Order Mennonites and Old Order Amish. But so few are using German as their primary language of reading and writing. But we still have 500,000 people, 500,000 speaking Pennsylvania Dutch. That's a significant, significant number. But the language is in decline. There have been a few developments that have really hurt Pennsylvania Dutch cultural pride and language. One is that we've had 2 world wars where Germany is our enemy, so it's not common, or I should say it's not popular to embrace your German heritage. Also, just the nature of these public schools is changing. We're shifting more and more from a one-room schoolhouse model to larger school buildings that are attended by many students coming farther distances. And sociologists have studied this trend where, especially in the 1940s and 50s, Pennsylvania Dutch parents were concerned that now that my child is going to a larger schoolhouse, if I teach them Pennsylvania Dutch before English, then I feel like I'm going to set my kids back. One of my favorite books is this one called The Pennsylvania Dutch by Frederick Claes, which by coincidence he wrote in 1950. And I love this book because it's old enough to have some quaintness, but it's new enough to be good scholarship, well researched. And in 1950, Frederick Claes said the following: "It is clear that Pennsylvania Dutch is in trouble, and in 100 years, it will be dead." So that's disconcerting, especially since he said that 76 years ago. But was he correct? So if we go to today, or last year, what is the status of the Pennsylvania Dutch language today? Well, it depends who you ask. About 20 years ago, the Reading Eagle had an article, Dying Dialect, Young Not Learning Pennsylvania German. So they're definitely in agreement with the Frederick Claes prediction. But then, 10 years ago, the Allentown Morning Call has an article, Why Pennsylvania Dutch is Thriving. So if you look at these, Dying Dialect, Pennsylvania Dutch Thriving, these are incongruous with one another. They don't agree with each other. So which is correct? Well, I think both are wrong and both are right. The Reading Eagle and Frederick Claes, they were thinking about the fancy Dutch. And Pennsylvania Dutch is in steep decline amongst the fancy Dutch. But with the plain Dutch, it is thriving because plain Dutch tend to have large families, and they are teaching their families to speak Pennsylvania Dutch as their first language. And in fact, sociologists say that Pennsylvania Dutch is one of the fastest growing minority languages in the United States. So you have this curious trend where it's dying and thriving at the same time. So why does this matter? Why should we care about this? Well, in sociology and cultural anthropology, there's something with a fancy name, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And I won't get into all the layers of this hypothesis. I'll try and simplify it. The hypothesis says that language is like a glue, and it holds together all the elements of a unique culture. So it's great to have cooking and architecture and holiday traditions and things like that. But according to this hypothesis, language is the glue that holds all those pieces together. And when you lose the language, all these pieces of culture, these cultural elements, kind of become untethered and start to drift away. So my attitude has always been that preserving language is an act of sort of cultural preservation. It helps to preserve the culture because we're making sure that glue is still in existence. So that concludes my talk. Thank you very much.
I'm sure that raised some questions that you may have. I also realized one thing, if all the history teachers I ever had could make history come alive like this, I would have enjoyed going to class much more than I did. He did a beautiful job of presenting that to us. Now, questions. Dan has a microphone for you. I have a question for you while people are thinking. What is being done today to promote the Pennsylvania Dutch in our area, in the college area or in the high school area?
This is a good question. There is actually right now a group that includes about 20 people that's been organized through Kutztown University, and they've been looking at this very question, trying to think about, are there ways that we can infuse Pennsylvania Dutch into maybe German language programs at high schools and colleges. And so there are about 20 of us on this committee, and I wouldn't say we have good answers yet, but we're really exploring that very question. Kutztown University does have a Pennsylvania German Studies minor, but unfortunately they dropped the language component from that minor, so they are not teaching the language, and a lot of people are actually very upset about that, and including people at Kutztown. There are a lot of Pennsylvania Dutch language classes available in conversation groups and things like this, but I think we need more of them, more opportunities like that.
Dan, do you have anybody with a hand up?
Anyone else have a question?
Well, if there are no other questions, maybe I'll share one more thing.
What that means is that you did such a good job, you answered all of our questions. Thank you so much. Sure. Thank you. Oh, another, Frederick Living, thank you.
We'll take the bonus features.
You want bonus features? All right. So I'm going to teach you a poem I learned when I was a little child. The Johnny Gate Fat. The Johnny goes away. And it goes like this. I'll say it once, and then I'll say it again slow, and I'll let you repeat after me. And at some point, I'll translate it for you. The Johnny Gate Fat. The Johnny Gate Fat. The Johnny Gate Iva de Brick. The brick is verbroken. The Johnny's for sofa. The Johnny kommt nimmer zurück. So that some of you understood it. Has anyone ever heard this before? No. Nobody. So the translation, Johnny goes away. Johnny goes away. Johnny goes over the bridge. The bridge is broken. Johnny has drowned. Johnny is never coming back. What a terrible thing to teach to a toddler. But if you think about it, Rockabye Baby's a little bit morbid as well. So I guess this is in that same spirit. So now I'll say this poem again, and I'll pause after each line, and I encourage you to repeat after me. The Johnny Gate Fat. The Johnny Gate Fat. The Johnny Gate Iva die Brick. Die Brick is verbroken. The Johnny for sofa. The Johnny kommt nimmer zurück. Very good. So all of you are now Pennsylvania Dutch speakers. Sehr wahr, wunderbar. Yes.
Drowned. Drowned?
Yeah, although I've also heard that for drunk.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
But I think my parents would have said Persephone for
Oh.
drunker.
Yeah.
Rather than just Persephone.
Yeah, uh-huh.
But that's just what
Yeah,
I
I heard it for both, yeah. And I remember hearing a song where the lyric went, my geld is for sofa, my money is drunk up with alcohol. Also a weird thing to teach a little kid, but. So the other thing I was going to teach you is a little song. Has anyone ever heard the Schnitzelbank song? So when I was little, we sang all the time in Pennsylvania Dutch. And we would laugh and laugh and laugh singing these songs. And my dad, when he was little, spent his summers at his grandparents' summer cabin. And he would be there with his grandparents and his great aunts and uncles, his sister, all their cousins. And his grandfather, Smith, my great-grandfather, had a Schnitzelbank poster like this one. And he'd point to the pictures, and all the kids would sing along. So this was my dad's favorite song. And we sang this all the time when I was a little kid. And the basic line, and by the way, you will see this both in German and in English, and in Pennsylvania Dutch. The way this song got here, this is actually a song that Germans from northern Germany, non-Pennsylvania Dutch, brought with them in the 1800s. The Pennsylvania Dutch at this time already have a rich singing tradition and a lot of silly songs. And when they hear this silly song that the Germans are singing, they think, we've got to change this into Pennsylvania Dutch. So they just have to make a few tweaks. So for example, the first line in German is, Ist das nicht ein Schnitzelbank? That's German. But in Pennsylvania Dutch, we'd say, Ist das nicht ein Schnitzelbank? So that's the difference between standard German on the top and Pennsylvania Dutch on the bottom. And basically, you sing a little chorus, and then you go through all these pictures, singing about all the pictures. It's very much like the 12 Days of Christmas, where you start little and then you get big. So maybe what I'll do, just for fun, is I'll sing the very first verse and then the very last verse for you. So it starts with a Schnitzelbank, which is a cutting bench, and a großer Schrank, a big cupboard. So it goes like this. Ist das nicht ein Schnitzelbank? Ja, das ist ein Schnitzelbank. Ist das nicht ein großer Schrank? Ja, das ist ein großer Schrank. Großer Schrank, Schnitzelbank. Du schöne, I du schöne, I du schöne Schnitzelbank. That was good. Wir haben gut gedu. We did well. So then when you get to the last one, it goes like this. And I might not remember them all, but I'll try it. Ist das nicht ein Pferdegans? Ja, das ist ein Pferdegans. Ist das nicht ein Ochsenschwanz? Ja, das ist ein Ochsenschwanz. Pferdegans, Ochsenschwanz, Wichte Drum, Christogsbaum, Dapikding, Hoxikring, Wilde Hast, Ciderglas, Wunderfitz, Schnickelfritz, Welschkan Bosch, Langiwascht, Aldikies, Hafermischt, Wolgerad, Grummengrad, Großer Schank, Schnitzelbank. I do shany, I do shany, I do shany, Schnitzelbank. Salvarshe. So I'll say one last thing, and I promise I'll give up the floor. So when I was in college, we had the emergence of a new store, Kinko's. Does anyone remember Kinko's? Kinko's was one of the first places you could go and say, photocopy this. So my dad went to Kinko's with his Schnitzelbank poster, and he said, I want you to make this as big a size as your machines will print. And he made these giant Schnitzelbank posters, and he gave one to me and one to each of my 3 siblings. And we range in age from, at that point, between 12 and 18. And we get these giant Schnitzelbank posters, and we think, what in the world are we supposed to do with these? So my dad's passed away. I would give all I own to sing a Schnitzelbank song with my dad again. And I share that, I think it's important to share that, to point out that whatever your cultural background, these cultural traditions have a richness that is so much more special than TV and video games and stuff like that. So if you've got grandchildren or neighbors or anyone, and you've got a cultural tradition, be it Pennsylvania Dutch or otherwise, share it with them. Don't keep it to yourself. Share it, because they will remember. You will make an impact on them. And that's truly all I have to say. Thank you.